7 years of cold sheets. 7 years of silence across crowded banquet tables. Cerys wore her title like an iron collar, the untouched queen of a feral king. They called Kaelin a beast in whispers, a warlord who won a crown but refused his bride. She expected another lifetime of lonely winters. She never expected the night the great oak doors would shatter, bringing a ruined, desperate man to his knees at her hearth, begging for the very thing he abandoned. The fortress of Oakhaven did not foster romance. It was a brutal structure built of dark, porous stone that seemed to suck the heat from the hearths and the life from its inhabitants. Cerys knew every draught, every uneven flagstone, and every rusted iron sconce in the eastern wing. She had spent 7 years memorizing them. She stood by the narrow glass window of her solar, watching the courtyard below. Rain turned the packed earth into a thick, churned slurry. A dozen riders dragged their exhausted horses through the gates. At their head rode Kaelin. Even from 3 stories up, he looked massive. His fur-lined cloak was plastered to his broad shoulders, heavy with mud and sleet. He didn't look up. He never looked up. He dismounted with a heavy, jarring impact, handing his reins to a scurrying stable boy without a word. The lords and soldiers around him gave him a wide berth. They respected him. They feared him. But no one stood too close. Cerys turned away from the glass. The cold of the pain lingered on her fingertips. "My lady." A quiet voice spoke from the doorway. It was Bran, her steward, an older man with a face like weathered leather and a ledger permanently tucked under his arm. "The king has returned from the western ridge. The rebel camp is scattered." "Casualties?" Cerys asked, moving to her heavy oak desk. She didn't ask if her husband was hurt. She asked what it would cost the kingdom. 4 dead. 12 wounded. The king is uninjured, though the men say he took the vanguard himself. Again. Cerys picked up a quill, testing the tip against her thumb. "Have the kitchens prepare a heavier stew tonight. Extra rations of meat for the returning men. And send 3 casks of the ale we brewed in autumn down to the barracks. They will need it to sleep. And for the king's table. The usual." She said, her voice completely flat. "He will eat alone in the upper hall. Ensure the fires are lit." This was their marriage. It was a transaction of space and silence. 7 years ago, she had been a strategic alliance, the daughter of a wealthy lowland duke, offered to the terrifying alpha of the northern packs to secure a border. She had walked down the aisle shivering in white silk, terrified, but resolved to do her duty. She had waited in the bridal bed, listening to the wind howl outside. He had never come. The next morning he had sent a messenger to her chambers with a brief, formal note. She was the queen. She would have the run of the castle, an allowance, and her own guards, but she would not share his bed. She had cried once. Then she had locked her tears in a box in her mind, buried it deep, and set about running his ruin of a castle. She fired the embezzling stewards, repaired the leaking roofs, balanced the trade routes, and earned the grudging respect of a pack that initially viewed her as a fragile, useless human. That evening the great hall was loud. The soldiers were drinking off the adrenaline of the skirmish. Cerys sat at the high table, a platter of roasted root vegetables and venison before her. The chair to her right, a massive carved monstrosity of black oak, was empty. It remained empty until the second course. The heavy doors at the back of the hall groaned open. The roar of the soldiers died instantly. The silence that swept over the room was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. Kaelin walked in. He had washed the mud from his face, but he still wore his leather armor. His dark hair was damp, curling slightly at the nape of his neck. His jaw was tight, a muscle ticking violently beneath the skin. The air around him seemed to warp with a suppressed, terrifying energy. It wasn't just authority. It was the raw, predatory aura of an alpha teetering on the edge. He didn't look at the men. He walked straight to the high table. He didn't look at Cerys either. He dropped into his chair. The wood groaned under his weight. Cerys kept her eyes on her plate. She methodically cut a piece of venison. Eat, swallow, breathe, never let them see you shrink. A servant hurried forward, trembling visibly to pour wine into Kaelin's goblet. The boy's hand shook, and a single drop of dark red wine splashed onto the wooden table. Kaelin's hand snapped out. He didn't hit the boy, but he caught the servant's wrist with terrifying speed. His knuckles were white. A low, vibrating growl started in Kaelin's chest. It wasn't a human sound. It was the sound of a beast that had been let off the leash and didn't want to go back in the cage. The boy whimpered. "Let him go, Kaelin," Ceres said. Her voice wasn't loud, but in the dead silence of the hall, it rang like a bell. Kaelin froze. Slowly, agonizingly, he turned his head to look at her. His eyes, usually a dark, stormy grey, were flashing with an unnatural, luminescent amber. The wolf was right at the surface, looking through his pupils. "He spilt the wine," Kaelin rasped. His voice sounded like two stones grinding together. "It is only wine," Ceres said calmly, meeting his predatory stare without blinking, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "We have cellars full of it. Let the boy go." For a second she thought he might turn on her. She saw the primal conflict in his face, the violent urge fighting something older and deeper. Then he blinked. The amber receded, leaving behind an exhaustion so profound it looked like a physical wound. He released the boy's wrist. The servant scrambled backward and practically ran from the hall. Kaelin stared at his hands. They were trembling. He curled them into fists, resting them on the table. Without eating, without drinking, he stood up and walked out of the hall. Ceres took a slow breath, picking up her fork. The hall slowly returned to a dull murmur. She tasted nothing of her meal. Winter set in with a brutal finality. Snow piled in drifts against the fortress walls, sealing Oak Haven off from the rest of the world. With the physical isolation came a heightened, suffocating tension. The war was over, the borders secured, and now the lords of the pack had nothing to do but sit by the fires, drink heavily, and discuss politics. Specifically, they discussed the succession. Ceres sat in the small council chamber. The room smelled of wet dog pipe smoke and old sweat. Around the heavy circular table sat the 4 elder lords of the pack. Kaelin sat at the head. Ceres occupied a small chair near the window, ostensibly there to take notes on the winter grain stores. She knew perfectly well she was the subject of the meeting. Lord Garrett, a scarred, greying werewolf who had fought beside Kaelin's father, leaned forward. "The men are restless, Kaelin. We won the war. We took the territories. But a pack without a future is a dead pack." Kaelin stared at the map on the table. "We have a future. We have peace. Peace doesn't breed." Garrett said bluntly, "You are 30 years old. The Alpha line ends with you. Every day you sit on that throne without an heir, you invite a challenge. If you fall ill, if a stray arrow catches you in the spring, it's a bloodbath for the crown." Kaelin's voice was dangerously quiet. "Are you threatening me, Garrett? I am advising you, as is my right." Garrett glanced briefly at Ceres, his expression not unkind but brutally practical. 7 years is long enough. If the Queen is barren or if the union is incompatible, it can be set aside. The old laws allow for annulment if an heir is not produced in 5 years. You could take a mate from the northern packs, a wolf. Ceres didn't flinch. She kept her quill moving across the parchment, drawing a meticulous, meaningless line under a tally of wheat sacks. Her stomach twisted into cold, hard knots. It made sense. She was a human. She was untouched. She was essentially a political prisoner keeping a seat warm. She waited for Kaelin to agree. She waited for him to nod, to finally discard the wife he never wanted. No. The word dropped into the room like an anvil. Garrett frowned. "Kaelin, reason must prevail. I said no." Kaelin stood up. The chair scraped harshly against the stone floor. He leaned over the table, planting his knuckles on the map. The heavy scent of pine and impending violence flooded the room. "Ceres is my wife. She is your queen. There will be no annulment. There will be no northern mate. Then what is the plan? Another lord demanded. How do you secure the pack? I secure it by ripping the throat out of anyone who challenges me. Kaelin snarled. The meeting is over. He stormed out of the room. The door slammed so hard the hinges shrieked. The lord sat in silence. Garrett sighed, rubbing his face. He looked at Cerys. My lady, I mean no disrespect, but you must see the danger. I see it, Lord Garrett, Cerys said smoothly, closing her ledger. I will speak with him. She lied. She never spoke to him about such things. But the humiliation of being discussed like a broken broodmare stung hotter than the winter wind. She left the council chamber, her boots clicking sharply on the stone. She found him in the armory. It was a cavernous room, smelling of oil, iron, and rust. Kaelin was standing at a grinding wheel, sparks flying, as he violently sharpened a broadsword that was already lethal. He was wearing only a thin tunic, and she could see the heavy muscles of his back, bunching and flexing with every brutal swipe of the metal against the stone. Are you planning to fight the snowdrifts? Cerys asked. The wheel shrieked to a halt. Kaelin didn't turn around. His chest heaved. Leave, Cerys. No, she said. It was the first time in 7 years she had openly defied an order from him. Kaelin slowly turned. The shadows of the armory made the hollows of his eyes look deeper. He looked exhausted, haunted. The violent energy from the council room was gone, replaced by a frayed, vibrating tension. Garrett is right, Cerys said, keeping her distance. She crossed her arms, digging her nails into her own sleeves to keep her hands from shaking. You need an heir. If you annul the marriage, my father will not retaliate. He cannot afford to. I will sign the papers. You can send me back to the lowlands with a retinue, and you can marry a wolf. Kaelin stared at her. His eyes tracked over her, her rigid posture, her pale face, the absolute absence of hope in her expression. You want to go back, he stated. It wasn't a question. I want a life, Kaelin. She snapped the icy control, finally cracking just a fraction. I have spent my youth managing your ledgers and eating in silence while you pretend I don't exist. If I am useless to you, let me go. He took a step toward her. The sword hung loose in his hand. For a terrifying second she thought he might strike her. Instead he dropped the sword. It clattered loudly on the flagstones. He closed the distance between them in 3 long strides. Cerys held her ground, refusing to back away even as his massive frame towered over her. He was close enough now that she could feel the heat radiating off him. She could smell the ozone and sweat. He reached out. His hand hovered an inch from her face. His fingers were calloused, scarred, trembling violently. You are not useless. He whispered, his voice thick-sounding as though it were being ripped from his throat. You are the only thing holding this god-forsaken place together. Then why? Cerys demanded, her voice rising, the bitterness of 1,000 lonely nights bleeding through. Why do you leave me to rot in that wing? Why did you marry me? Kaelin closed his eyes. The hand hovering near her face clenched into a fist, and he pulled it back as if she were made of fire. Because if I touch you, he said, his voice dropping to a ragged, desperate rasp, I will never stop. And the thing inside me, the thing that won that war, it doesn't know how to be gentle. It only knows how to possess and destroy. He opened his eyes. The amber was there, swirling violently with the grey. I stay away to keep you alive, Cerys. Go back to your solar. Lock the door. He turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the armory. Cerys stood alone in the cold, the heat of his near touch still burning on her skin. The deep winter solstice brought a storm unlike any Oakhaven had seen in a decade. The wind shrieked around the towers like tortured souls, battering the stone walls and rattling the thick glass of the windows. The temperature dropped so fast the moats froze solid within hours. Inside the keep it wasn't much better. The fires fought a losing battle against the encroaching chill. But worse than the cold was the mood of the castle. The king had not been seen for 2 days. Calen had locked himself in his private quarters in the western tower. He had barred the door, refusing food, refusing his counsel, refusing even the healers. The pack could feel it. The wolves in the garrison were on edge, pacing, snapping at one another. The alpha's distress rippled through the pack bond like a poison. Cerys sat in her chambers, a heavy wool shawl wrapped around her shoulders. She held a book, but she hadn't turned a page in an hour. She couldn't stop thinking about the armory. "I stay away to keep you alive." It was a coward's excuse. It was the excuse of a man terrified of his own nature. But for the first time, Cerys realized he wasn't rejecting her. He was protecting her from himself. He was starving his own beast to keep her safe. And judging by the frantic pacing of the guards in the halls, the beast was finally starving to death. A terrible, low sound echoed through the stone of the castle. It wasn't a howl. It was a roar of sheer agonizing pain. Cerys stood up, the book tumbling to the floor. The sound came from the western tower. She didn't think. 7 years of caution, of staying in her lane, of playing the quiet, untouched queen, vanished. She threw the shawl off and walked out the door. The corridors were empty. The servants had hidden themselves away. The few guards she passed looked terrified, their eyes glowing faintly in the dim light of the torches, fighting their own instincts to go to their alpha or flee from him. Cerys climbed the spiral stairs to the western tower. The air grew colder here. The stone was slick with frost. She reached the heavy iron-banded door of Calen's quarters. 2 of his most trusted guards, towering men in heavy furs, stood before it. They looked at her with wide, panicked eyes. "My lady, you cannot—" One of them said, stepping into her path. The madness is on him. The transition is stuck. If he gets out or if you go in—" "Step aside, Marcus," Cerys said. "My lady, please." He gave strict orders. No one. Another agonizing roar shuddered through the heavy wood of the door. It was the sound of bones breaking, of a creature tearing itself apart from the inside. "He is dying in there," Cerys said, her voice dropping to a deadly, icy calm. "He is fighting his own nature because he thinks he has to. I am his wife. Step aside." The guards hesitated. Human she might be, but she was the queen. She had fed them, managed them, and held their world together for 7 years. Slowly they parted. Cerys lifted the heavy iron latch. The door was barred from the inside, but as she pushed, she felt the thick wooden beam on the other side splintering under some immense weight. "Calen!" she called out, pressing her hands against the freezing wood. "Open the door!" A ragged, heavy breathing sounded from the other side. A heavy thud shook the frame. He was leaning against it. "Go. Away." His voice came distorted, guttural, barely recognizable as human speech. "No." Cerys slammed her open palms against the door. "I am done waiting, Calen. I am done sitting in silence. You open this door, or I will have the guards chop it down with axes." Silence. Then the sound of heavy timber dragging across stone. The bar was being moved. The door cracked open. Cerys pushed it the rest of the way. The room was destroyed. Tapestries were shredded, heavy oak furniture splintered into kindling. The air was thick, suffocating with the heat of fever sweat and the sharp metallic tang of copper. Calen was kneeling in the center of the wreckage. He was half-shifted, a grotesque, agonizing state between man and wolf. His spine arched unnaturally, his muscles bulging and tearing beneath his skin. His hands were tipped with long, bloody claws where he had been tearing at the stone floor. Dark veins pulsed violently up his neck. He looked up at her. His eyes were entirely amber now, glowing in the dark room. The beast was there, completely exposed. But beneath the predatory stare, there was a profound human terror. "Run!" He choked out blood, spilling from his lips as his jaw dislocated and snapped back into place. Cerys felt the primal human instinct screaming at her to flee. Every nerve in her body told her this was a monster, an apex predator that would snap her neck in a heartbeat. She closed the door behind her. She stepped into the room. Her soft slippers made no sound on the ruined floor. "I am not running," she said quietly. She walked toward him. Kalen backed away, a low snarl ripping from his throat. He hit the stone wall, trapping himself. He threw his arms over his head, curling inward, hiding from her, protecting her from the sight of him. "Ceres, please," he begged the word, ending in a whine. "I will hurt you. The wolf, it needs." "What does it need?" she asked. She stopped a foot away from him. He was shivering uncontrollably. The massive warlord, the terror of the north, was huddled against the cold stone, weeping. "A mate," he whispered into his hands. "It needs its mate. But if I take you, I will break you. I am a monster." Ceres looked down at him. 7 years of resentment, of feeling unwanted and unloved, finally clicked into place. He hadn't abandoned her. He had martyred himself. He had denied his most fundamental instinct, tearing his own soul apart year after year, just to keep a fragile human girl safe. Slowly Ceres knelt on the ruined floor. The stone was freezing against her knees. She reached out. She didn't hesitate. She placed her bare, warm hands over his massive, bloodied claws. Kalen flinched violently, but he didn't pull away. He froze his breathing, hitching. "You are a king," Ceres said, her voice firm, steady, anchoring him to the room. "You are the man who held this territory together, and you are my husband." She pried his hands away from his face. He looked at her, his amber eyes wide, terrifying and utterly vulnerable. "I have survived this fortress. I have survived 7 years of your silence," Ceres said, leaning closer. She could feel the violent heat radiating off him. "Do not insult me by thinking I am too fragile to survive you." Kalen let out a sound that broke in the middle, half sob, half growl. He surged forward. He didn't attack. He collapsed. His massive arms wrapped around her waist, burying his face into her stomach. He held on to her as if she were the only solid thing in a collapsing universe. He trembled violently, his claws carefully, agonizingly retracting, making sure they didn't pierce her gown. "Please," he begged the Alpha King, broken on the stone floor, sobbing into his wife's skirts. "Please, I am starving. I am so cold. Don't leave me, please." Ceres slowly brought her hands down, resting them in his thick, sweat-soaked hair. She felt the heavy, thudding rhythm of his heart against her legs. "I'm here," she said softly, staring over his head at the ruined room. "I'm not going anywhere." The fever broke just before dawn. Kalen lay unconscious on the floor of his ruined quarters. The unnatural, bulging musculature of the half-shift had receded, leaving behind a man battered by his own body. He was covered in sweat dirt and dried blood from his torn cuticles. Ceres had not moved. Her legs were completely numb. She sat against the freezing stone wall, cradling his heavy head in her lap. She had spent the last 4 hours running her hands through his damp hair, humming a tuneless lowland lullaby, while he shuddered through the agonizing withdrawal of the beast. The door creaked open. Bran, her steward, slipped inside. He carried a heavy wool blanket and a basin of water. He took one look at the splintered furniture, the shredded tapestries, and the king sleeping with his head on the queen's lap. The old man's face gave nothing away. "The storm is passing, my lady," Bran said quietly, setting the basin down. "Have the bath in my solar filled," Ceres ordered, her voice a dry rasp. "Boiling water. And send for Rowan and Leif from the guard. No one else." Bran nodded and vanished. When the 2 guards arrived, they balked at the threshold. They were large men, seasoned fighters, but they looked at Kalen with the weary apprehension of men handling unexploded ordnance. "Pick him up," Ceres said. She pushed herself to her feet, leaning against the wall for a moment, as the blood rushed agonizingly back into her legs. "Carry him to my chambers. If anyone asks, the king took a chill." "My lady." Rowan started glancing nervously at Kaelin's bloodied hands. "Is it safe? He is exhausted, Rowan. Pick him up." They did. Kaelin was dead weight, a massive slab of muscle and bone. They hauled him down the spiral staircase through the quiet pre-dawn corridors and into the eastern wing. Keris followed her skirts, ruined her hands, stained with his blood. They laid him on her bed. It was a large, practical four-poster stripped of the ornamental silks and layered in heavy winter quilts. Cerys dismissed the guards and locked the door behind them. She turned back to the bed. Her husband looked wrong in her room. He was too large, too wild a storm cloud dragged indoors. She took a cloth, dipped it in the hot water Bran had brought, and wrung it out. She sat on the edge of the mattress and began to clean the dried blood from Kaelin's hands. She worked methodically. She cleaned the dirt from his knuckles. She wiped the sweat from his collarbones. She undid the laces of his ruined tunic and pulled it over his head, discarding it on the floor. His torso was a map of old violence. Scars crisscrossed his ribs, and shoulders faded white lines from swords, jagged marks from claws. 7 years, and she had never seen him without a shirt. Kaelin drew a sharp, sudden breath. His eyes snapped open. He didn't wake up slowly. He woke with the terrifying, explosive speed of an ambush predator. His hand clamped around Cerys's wrist like an iron vice. He lunged upward, pinning her to the mattress in a single fluid motion. The wet cloth dropped to the floor. Keris stared up at him. He was breathing hard, his chest heaving. His eyes were wild, darting around the unfamiliar room, processing the sense, the light, the threat. Then his gaze snapped down to her. He looked at his hand wrapped tight enough around her wrist to bruise. He looked at her small frame, pinned beneath his overwhelming weight. Horror washed over his face, sharp and absolute. He let go of her, as if her skin burned him. He threw himself backward, scrambling off the bed until his back hit the far wall. He dragged his knees up, burying his face in his hands. "I'm sorry," he choked out. The raw panic in his voice was sickening. "God, Cerys, I'm sorry. I didn't know where I was. I thought—" Cerys sat up slowly. She rubbed her wrist. It throbbed, but it wasn't broken. She looked at the warlord cowering against her bedroom wall. "You thought you were under attack," she said calmly. "You woke in a strange room. I could have broken your arm, but you didn't. I could have." He looked up, his eyes bloodshot, the grey completely eclipsing the amber. The beast was dormant, exhausted. Only the broken man remained. "This is why. This is exactly why. I am a hazard. I am a wild dog in a house made of glass." Keris stood up. She didn't approach him. She went to the wash basin and rinsed her hands. "Get up, Kaelin," she said. He didn't move. She turned to face him, grabbing a dry towel. "I said, get up. You smell like an abattoir. You have ruined my favorite quilt, and I am entirely out of patience for your self-pity." Kaelin blinked. The sharp, commanding tone cut through his panic. He stared at her, genuinely bewildered. "You have spent 7 years punishing us both because you are afraid of your own shadow." Cerys continued, her voice snapping like a whip in the quiet room. "You thought you were being noble. You thought you were saving me. Has it ever occurred to you to ask what I wanted?" Kaelin swallowed hard. He slowly pushed himself off the floor, standing to his full, towering height. He kept his distance. "You wanted a normal life, a human husband. I was given to you," Cerys said, "and I accepted that. I built a life here. I learned your ledgers, I fed your men. I kept this miserable pile of rocks from freezing over. I did my duty, and my reward was a ghost for a husband." She threw the towel at him. He caught it instinctively. "Wash yourself," she ordered. "There is hot water in the adjoining room, and when you are done you are going to come back in here, and we are going to talk." She sat down in the heavy armchair by the fire, crossing her arms. Kaelin looked at the towel, then at her. For a moment the Alpha flared a brief, indignant spark at being commanded in his own castle, but it died, quickly replaced by a strange, profound relief. He wasn't being feared. He was being scolded. He turned and walked into the bathing room. The fire had burned down to a low, pulsing bed of embers by the time Kaelin returned. He wore a clean pair of linen trousers Bran must have left by the door, but his chest was bare. His hair was wet, combed back from his face. He looked cleaner. He looked infinitely more human. But the tension in his frame was wound tighter than a bowstring. Cerys hadn't moved from the armchair. She watched him walk into the room. He didn't pace. He stood in the center of the rug, completely still, waiting for her to speak. "Sit," she said, gesturing to the foot of the bed. He sat. The mattress groaned under his weight. He rested his elbows on his knees, clasping his hands together and staring at the floor. "The madness," Cerys said, keeping her voice even. "Is it gone?" "For now," Kaelin answered softly. "It builds when the wolf is denied. When the winter traps us inside, it gets worse. Last night was the breaking point." "Because of the council meeting." He looked up at her, a bitter smile touching the corner of his mouth. "Because Garrett told me to replace you, and the wolf wanted to tear his throat out for suggesting it." Cerys felt a sudden, sharp tightness in her chest. She ignored it. "You told me yesterday that you stay away because you would destroy me, because you only know how to possess." "It's true. No, it is an excuse." Cerys leaned forward. "You are not an animal, Kaelin. You are a man who commands animals. You hold back armies. You control a territory the size of a country. You have absolute discipline in every aspect of your life except this. You don't understand the bond," he argued, his voice tightening. "You are human. You don't feel it. When an alpha takes a mate, it is not politics. It is a biological absolute. It is violent. It is consuming. If I cross that line with you, I can never uncross it. I will never let you go. I will smother you." "I am already smothered," Cerys fired back. "I am buried alive in this castle. You think your distance is kindness, it is torture. I am your wife in name, your steward in practice, and a stranger to your face." She stood up. She walked over to him, stopping right in front of him. Kaelin's breathing hitched. He stared at her stomach, refusing to look up into her eyes. His hands gripped his knees hard enough to turn his knuckles white. "Look at me," she commanded. Slowly, agonizingly, he lifted his head. His eyes were a dark, stormy grey. They were filled with an ancient, desperate hunger. "You think you will break me," Cerys said quietly. "You think I am glass." She reached out and took his hand. It was massive, calloused, and trembling. She placed it flat against the center of her chest, right over her heart. "Feel that," she whispered. Beneath his palm, her heart beat with a steady, fierce rhythm. It wasn't fluttering with panic. It was pounding with absolute, grounded certainty. "It's not breaking," she said. "I am not breaking." Kaelin let out a ragged breath. His hand remained pressed against her chest. He closed his eyes, his forehead dropping until it rested against her stomach. He was breathing in her scent, lavender-old paper, and the distinct warm undertone that was purely her. "Cerys," he whispered into the fabric of her gown. It sounded like a prayer. "Claim me, Kaelin." He froze. His head snapped up. "What did you say?" I said claim me." Cerys looked down at him, her expression fiercely determined. "I am tired of waiting. I am tired of the cold. You want a mate? Then take your mate. Stop hiding in the dark and be my husband." A deep, vibrating sound started in Kaelin's chest. It wasn't the agonizing roar of the transition. It was a purr. It was the terrifying, rhythmic rumble of a predator that had just been handed the keys to its cage. He stood up. He loomed over her, blocking out the light of the fire. The space between them vanished. If I do this... Kalen rasped, his voice dropping an octave rough with raw need. There is no going back to the lowlands. There is no annulment. You are mine. For this life and whatever comes after, I will not share you. I will not let you leave. I don't want to leave, she answered, holding her ground. I want you. The last thread of his restraint snapped. He didn't grab her violently. He didn't tear at her clothes. Instead, his massive hands framed her face with a gentleness that was entirely at odds with his size. He tilted her head up his thumbs, tracing her cheekbones with a trembling, reverent touch. Please! He begged, his voice cracking. Let me love you, please. Yes, she breathed. He kissed her. It was a collision. 7 years of starvation, of looking across crowded halls of rigid control, all of it poured into a single desperate point of contact. His mouth was hot, demanding, and incredibly thorough. Keris gasped, and he swallowed the sound, pulling her flush against his chest. She felt the crushing strength of his arms wrapping around her, lifting her off the floor. She wrapped her arms around his neck, her fingers digging into his damp hair. The sheer physical power of him was overwhelming a tide that threatened to drown her. But he didn't crush her. He held her tight enough to anchor her, but not enough to bruise. He carried her the 2 steps to the bed and followed her down onto the mattress. The cold of the winter night disappeared. The room shrank down to the heat of his skin, the heavy, rhythmic thud of his heart, and the desperate, frantic slide of his hands. He worshipped her. He touched her like she was a holy relic he had finally been allowed to hold. Every kiss, every touch was laced with an apology and a promise. When he finally pushed her gown from her shoulders, the cool air hit her skin for only a second before his heat covered her completely. He stopped hovering over her, his forearms braced on either side of her head. The amber had bled back into his eyes, glowing fiercely in the dim light. The wolf was there. It was dominant, territorial, and entirely focused on her. Tell me to stop, he whispered, a vein pulsing hard at his temple as he fought his own biology. If you are afraid, tell me to stop now. Eris reached up, tracing the hard line of his jaw. She looked into the glowing, predatory eyes of the beast they called a warlord. Don't you dare stop, she whispered. Kalen groaned a sound of absolute surrender and buried his face in her neck. He claimed her. Not with violence, but with a total, all-consuming devotion. He stripped away the untouched, icy queen of Oakhaven, leaving only a woman fiercely alive, anchored to the bed by the sheer desperate gravity of the king. Morning came with the sharp, blinding glare of sunlight reflecting off the snowdrifts outside the window. Ceres woke slowly. She was impossibly warm. The heavy winter quilts were pooled around her waist, but the real heat came from the furnace of the man wrapped around her. Kalen lay on his side, his arm heavy across her ribs, pulling her back flush against his chest. His face was buried in the space between her neck and shoulder. He was deeply asleep, his breathing slow and even. The frantic, vibrating tension that had defined him for 7 years was gone. He felt settled. Ceres didn't move. She let herself exist in the quiet. Her body ached a deep, unfamiliar soreness that made her flush when she remembered the hours before dawn. He had been relentless, but he had been careful. Every time the wolf had surged, threatening to take over, Kalen had pulled it back, checking her breathing, checking her eyes, ensuring she was with him. He had not broken her. He had remade her. A heavy knock sounded at the chamber door. Kalen's eyes snapped open. The arm around her tightened instantly, pulling her closer in a pure, possessive reflex. A low growl rumbled in his throat. "It's just the door," Ceres murmured, reaching over to rest her hand on his forearm. He blinked, the aggression fading as he processed her touch. He pressed a kiss to her bare shoulder. "Who is it?" He called out, his voice a sleep rough rasp. "Bran, your grace." The steward's muffled voice came through the thick oak. The midday meal is being served in the Great Hall. The council is inquiring after your health. Tell them I am perfectly well. Kaelin answered. We will be down shortly. Silence from the hallway. Then a hesitant, Both of you, sire. Yes, Bran, both of us? Very good, sire. Footsteps retreated. Kaelin rolled onto his back, pulling Cerys with him until she was resting half on top of his chest. He looked up at the canopy of the bed, a small, genuine smile playing on his lips. It transformed his face, making him look years younger, shedding the brutal mask of the warlord. They are going to stare. Cerys noted resting her chin on her hands, supported by his chest. Let them. Kaelin reached up, tracing a stray lock of hair behind her ear. His fingers grazed the faint red mark on the side of her neck, where his teeth had scraped her skin during the height of the night. His eyes darkened as he looked at it. You smell different. I smell like you. You smell like my mate. He said the word with a heavy, satisfied finality. He sat up, bringing her with him, kissing her deeply before setting her back against the pillows. Get dressed, wear something warm, and wear the heavy silver chain. Cerys raised an eyebrow. The ceremonial collar, it weighs 10 pounds. It is the mark of the Queen, Kaelin said, standing up and reaching for his discarded trousers. Today I want them to see it. An hour later they walked down the main staircase. Cerys wore a gown of dark forest green wool, lined with black fur. Around her neck hung the heavy, intricate silver chain of the Oakhaven matriarch. She usually avoided it, finding it gaudy, but today it felt like armor. Kaelin walked beside her. He wore his leathers, but he had left the heavy cloak behind. He moved differently. The coiled defensive aggression was gone, replaced by a loose, rolling confidence. He didn't walk ahead of her. He walked exactly at her side. As they approached the heavy oak doors of the Great Hall, Cerys felt a spike of nerves. 7 years of carefully curated distance were about to be publicly shattered. Kaelin stopped. He looked down at her. He didn't offer a reassuring smile. He offered a predatory one. He reached out and took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. Ready? He asked. Open the doors. She replied. The guards pulled the heavy iron rings. The doors swung open. The Great Hall was packed. The lords, the captains, the extended pack members who had sheltered for the winter, they were all gathered at the long wooden tables, eating and talking in a dull roar. As Kaelin and Cerys stepped over the threshold, the noise died. It didn't fade. It cut off completely, as if a blade had severed the sound. Every werewolf in the room turned their head. Cerys knew what was happening. They weren't just looking at them. They were smelling them. The complex, highly attuned senses of the pack were immediately hit by the change in the air. The king's scent was no longer isolated and frantic. It was deeply intertwined with the queen's, settling into a heavy, dominant signature of a completed alpha pair. Kaelin didn't pause. He walked forward, pulling Cerys with him. The crowd parted instantly. They reached the high table. Lord Garrett and the other council members were already seated. Garrett's eyes were wide, darting from Kaelin's relaxed posture to Cerys and finally to their joined hands. Kaelin pulled out the massive black oak chair at the head of the table. He didn't sit in it. He gestured for Cerys to sit. A ripple of shock went through the lords. That was the Alpha's chair. Eris kept her face entirely blank. She stepped forward and sat down in the heavy chair. It dwarfed her, but she sat with her spine completely straight, resting her hands on the armrests. Kaelin signaled a servant. Bring another chair. The servant scrambled to fetch a heavy dining chair, placing it immediately to Cerys's right, practically touching her armrest. Kaelin sat down. Garrett cleared his throat. He looked like a man who had prepared a speech for a funeral and was suddenly asked to give a wedding toast. My king, we are glad to see you recovered. The storm is over, Garrett. Kalen interrupted smoothly. He poured a goblet of water and handed it to Ceres before pouring his own ale. "We have wintered long enough. What is the status of the northern mountain passes?" Garrett blinked, struggling to switch gears to military logistics, while staring at the undeniable proof that his advice from yesterday had been violently rendered obsolete. The scouts report heavy snow, sire, impassable for at least another month, but we received a raven this morning from the eastern border. Kalen's relaxed demeanor sharpened just a fraction. And Garrett glanced at Ceres. For the first time in 7 years, he didn't look at her like a useless human appendix. He looked at her like a variable he hadn't calculated for. "It's from the Vane territory," Garrett said grimly. "Lord Vane is dead. His son Malachor has claimed the Alpha position, and he has sent a formal challenge. He claims the treaty you signed with his father is null and void." The temperature in the hall seemed to drop 10 degrees. The Vane Pack was the largest rival on the continent. A challenge meant border raids. It meant war. Kalen took a slow drink of his ale. He set the cup down. He looked at Garrett, and the amber flickered dangerously in his eyes. "Ah. Send a raven back to Malachor." Kalen said, his voice carrying clearly to the back of the silent hall. "Tell him the treaty stands. Tell him if he crosses the river into my territory, I will string his pelt from the gates of Oakhaven." "He will view that as an insult, Kalen," one of the other lords cautioned. "He may march on us before the thaw. He has the numbers to test our defenses." Kalen leaned back in his chair, resting his arm on the back of Ceres's seat. An incredibly casual, yet wildly possessive gesture. "Let him test them," Kalen said softly, a dark, terrifying smile spreading across his face. "I have never felt more like fighting." War in the north was not a grand affair of shining cavalry and bright banners. It was fought in the mud in the freezing sleet over bitter strips of frozen land. Malachor Vane did not wait for the spring thaw. 3 weeks after his challenge arrived, scouts reported a massive war band crossing the frozen river at the eastern gorge. They were moving fast, unencumbered by heavy supply wagons living off the land and whatever they could pillage. The council chamber at Oakhaven was stifling. Maps were weighed down by iron daggers. Kalen stood at the head of the table, his hands planted flat against the wood. The heavy, dark energy of the Alpha radiated from him, keeping the older lords quiet and focused. "He is moving for the High Ridge villages," Lord Garrett said, tracing a scarred finger along a charcoal line on the parchment. "He wants to burn the winter stores. If he starves the outer rim, he forces our hand. We will have to deploy the main garrison to defend the farmers, leaving the fortress vulnerable. Then we intercept him at the gorge," a younger captain suggested. "Bottle them up in the pass. He has 600 wolves," Kalen replied, his voice flat. "We have 400 capable fighters currently at the keep. If we meet them in the pass, it is a meat grinder. We might win, but we lose half our fighting force doing it." Ceres sat in her usual chair near the window, but she wasn't holding her ledger today. She was looking at the map. For 7 years, she had done nothing but manage this territory. She knew exactly how much grain was in the High Ridge silos. She knew the repair schedules of the carts, the depth of the rivers, and the exact rot in the wooden bridges spanning the eastern valleys. "He is not going to the High Ridge villages," Ceres said. The room fell silent. 5 veteran warlords turned to look at the human queen. A month ago, Garrett would have dismissed her entirely. Today, he merely frowned. "My lady," Garrett said carefully. "His trajectory is a straight line to the ridge." Ceres stood up. She walked to the table, stepping into the heavy, tense space normally reserved only for the Alpha and his commanders. Kalen didn't move. He watched her, his amber eyes tracking her every movement with a dark, quiet pride. "He is marching a straight line because he wants your scouts to report a straight line," Ceres said. She picked up an iron dagger and moved it off the charcoal path, slamming it down on a seemingly empty patch of forest to the south. "He is going here." Garrett squinted. "The Blackwood, apologies the southern timber yards, There is nothing there but felled trees and an old mill. There is the old logging road. Ceres corrected him. It is entirely covered by the forest canopy. The snow won't be as deep. If he takes the logging road, he bypasses the ridge entirely and brings 600 wolves within striking distance of our southern gates by tomorrow night. The captains murmured, exchanging uneasy glances. Why would he risk it? One asked. If we catch him on the logging road, he's trapped. Because he thinks we are starving, Ceres said smoothly. For years, the Vane Pack has operated on the assumption that Oakhaven barely survives its winters. He assumes our men are weak, our stores are empty, and our king is erratic. She glanced at Kaelin, acknowledging the hard truth of their past. He thinks he can kick the door in before we have the strength to hold it closed. Kaelin leaned over the table, staring at the dagger Ceres had placed. And the stores at the ridge, I ordered them emptied 3 weeks ago. Ceres stated, her voice devoid of any boastfulness. It was simple mathematics. When the Raven arrived with the challenge, I had Bran hire every available cart. The grain is already in the lower cellars of this keep. If Malika goes to the ridge, he finds empty silos and freezing wind. Garrett stared at her. You moved 40 tons of grain without the council knowing. The council was busy debating how to reply to a raven. Ceres said dryly. I was busy making sure we could eat during a siege. A slow, terrifying grin spread across Kaelin's face. He looked from the map to his wife. The sheer predatory thrill in his eyes made the hairs on the back of Ceres's neck stand up. She is right. Kaelin said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal rumble. He is aiming for the throat. He will take the logging road. He stood to his full height, the grin vanishing, replaced by cold, absolute command. Garrett, take 50 men. Ride to the high ridge and light the watchfires. Make it look like the main host is waiting for him there. Kaelin pointed to the dagger Ceres had placed. The rest of the garrison marches south with me. We will hide in the timber yards. When he comes down that road thinking he has outsmarted us, we break his lines. The lords slammed their fists against their chests in a uniform salute. The room emptied quickly, the air charged with the sudden violent anticipation of impending slaughter. Ceres remained at the table. She stared at the map. The reality of what she had just done settled in her stomach like a cold stone. She hadn't just managed a ledger, she had just plotted an ambush. She had sent men to bleed. Kaelin walked around the table. He stopped behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and pulling her back against his chest. He buried his face in her hair, inhaling deeply. You are a terrifying woman. He murmured, his voice a warm vibration against her back. I am a practical woman, Ceres corrected, resting her hands over his thick forearms. If he breaches the walls, he will kill the servants. He will kill Bran. I won't allow it. Kaelin turned her around. He framed her face, his thumbs stroking her cheekbones. The armor he wore was cold, but his skin was burning. I will not let him near the walls, Kaelin promised. The grey in his eyes was entirely eclipsed by the amber of the wolf. He was ready for the violence. He needed it. I will be back before the dawn. He kissed her. It was brief, hard, and tasted of iron and adrenaline. Then he turned and walked out of the chamber to lead his men into the dark. The night was agonizing. Ceres did not retreat to her solar. She established herself in the lower bailey. The courtyard was a hive of organized panic. She directed the servants to boil water in massive iron vats. She had the heavy oak tables dragged out from the kitchens to serve as triage stations. She ordered the women and children into the deep cellars, leaving only those who could carry a bucket or hold a bandage above ground. Bran stayed by her side, a silent, steadying presence. You should be inside, my lady, the old steward said quietly, as the wind whipped snow across the courtyard. If the men return wounded, they need to see that the keep is holding. Ceres replied, tying a thick linen apron over her woolen gown. They need to know what they are bleeding for. Hours dragged. The cold seeped through the soles of her boots. The silence from the southern forest was absolute and terrifying. Then, just past midnight, the sound reached them. It wasn't the clash of steel. It was a howl. It started low, a guttural, earth-shaking vibration that seemed to roll over the tops of the trees. It was joined by another and another until the night air was completely fractured by the deafening, blood-chilling roar of 400 northern wolves engaging the enemy. The sound hit the courtyard like a physical blow. Several servants dropped their buckets covering their ears. Keris gripped the edge of a triage table, her knuckles white. She recognized the dominant, terrifying roar beneath the chorus. It was Kaelin. The battle lasted for hours, but it felt like a lifetime. Slowly, the noise shifted. The unified roar of the Vane Pack splintered, turning into panicked, disorganized yelps and the heavy, wet sounds of a rout. The northern wolves were pushing them back. Just before dawn, the gates of Oakhaven groaned open. The vanguard returned first. They were covered in mud, snow, and blood. Some limped, supported by their brothers. Others carried the dead draped across the backs of exhausted horses. The smell of copper and wet fur filled the courtyard. Cerys didn't flinch. She went to work. She directed the wounded to the tables. She packed wounds with boiled linen and herbs, her hands steady even as her gown became stained with the blood of her husband's soldiers. She didn't ask if they had won. The fact that they were walking through the gates meant the keep was safe. She kept looking at the gate, searching the faces of the returning men. Finally, the main host rode in. At the center of the column rode Kaelin. His dark war horse was lathered in sweat. Kaelin's armor was dented, the leather slashed in several places. His face was smeared with ash and dark, drying blood. In his right hand he dragged a massive, heavy length of fabric. It was the banner of the Vane Pack. The courtyard fell dead silent as the king dismounted. He threw the ruined banner onto the muddy cobblestones. "Malachor Vane is dead," Kaelin announced. His voice was hoarse, raspy from roaring, but it carried to every corner of the keep. "His lieutenants are dead. The rest of his pack is running back across the river. They will not return." A ragged, exhausted cheer went up from the men. Kaelin didn't celebrate. He handed his reins to a soldier and turned his amber eyes scanning the chaotic courtyard. He found her. Cerys stood by a wooden table, her hands covered in blood, an improvised bandage still clutched in her fingers. She looked exhausted, pale, and entirely resolute. Kaelin walked through the crowd. The soldiers parted for him instantly. He didn't care about the mud, the blood, or the hundreds of eyes watching them. He reached her, dropped his heavy gauntlets to the ground, and pulled her into his chest. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling the scent of her sweat, the herbs and the copper. He let out a long, heavy breath, the terrifying tension of the alpha finally draining out of his massive frame. "You held the keep," he whispered. "You held the line." Keris answered, wrapping her blood-stained arms around his armored back. They stood there in the center of the courtyard, the warlord and the steward queen anchored to one another amidst the wreckage of the night. Spring arrived at Oakhaven not with a whisper, but with the violent cracking of ice. The moats thawed, the snowmelt rushed down the mountain passes, and the heavy, suffocating isolation of the winter finally broke. The fortress changed. The great oak doors of the upper hall were left open. The fires in the hearths burned bright, not to fight the lethal cold, but to warm the massive space. The silence that had once defined the castle was gone, replaced by the constant thrumming noise of a pack that had survived a war and found its center. Cerys sat at the high table. It was the evening meal, and the hall was packed. She wasn't eating in silence. She was arguing with Lord Garrett over the taxation of the new eastern trade routes. "You cannot tax the grain carts at the same rate as the iron shipments," Cerys pointed out, tapping a slender finger against the polished wood of the table. "Grain is perishable. Iron is not. If you tax them equally, the farmers will simply stop bringing the surplus to the keep." Garrett grumbled, rubbing his scarred jaw. "It is the traditional rate, my queen. Tradition does not fill the granary, Garrett. Math does. A low, vibrating chuckle sounded from the chair beside her. Kalen sat reclined in his heavy, carved seat. He held a goblet of ale loosely in one hand. He watched the exchange with an expression of pure, unadulterated amusement. The haunted, hollowed-out warlord of the winter was a memory. He looked rested. He looked dangerous, yes, but the danger was controlled, housed safely behind the calm, observant gaze of a king who knew exactly what belonged to him. "Listen to her, Garrett." Kalen rumbled, taking a slow drink. "She outsmarted Malachor. She will certainly outsmart you." Garrett sighed in defeat, bowing his head respectfully. "As you say, sire. I will adjust the ledgers in the morning." The meal concluded with the usual boisterous noise of the pack. As the hour grew late, the lords began to filter out toward the barracks and their own quarters. Kalen stood up, offering his hand to Ceres. She took it, letting him pull her to her feet. They walked together out of the great hall, moving away from the noise, and up the spiral stone steps to the eastern wing. Their chambers had been merged. The heavy dividing doors had been taken off their hinges entirely. The space was now a massive shared sanctuary of furs, warmth, and quiet. Kalen closed the thick outer door, dropping the iron latch into place. The sound of the keep faded away completely. He turned to her. He didn't say a word. He just crossed the room, picked her up by the waist, and backed her against the heavy wooden door. Ceres gasped, laughing softly as her feet left the ground. She wrapped her legs around his waist, her hands instantly going to his dark, curling hair. "You were staring at me all through dinner," Ceres whispered against his mouth. "I am always staring at you." Kalen replied, his voice a dark, rough purr. He kissed her jaw, his teeth scraping lightly against her collarbone. 7 years I sat in that hall and forced myself not to look at you. I am making up for lost time. He carried her to the massive 4-poster bed, following her down into the heavy quilts. There was no fear left. The beast inside Kalen was no longer a starved, frantic thing trying to break its cage. It was fed, it was grounded, and it was entirely devoted to the human woman who held its leash. As he stripped away her gown, his hands were steady, tracing the lines of her body with a familiar, reverent worship. Ceres pulled him down, meeting his heat with her own, no longer the fragile girl waiting in a cold room, but the fiercely alive anchor of the Northern King. The wind howled outside the thick glass windows of Oakhaven, battering the ancient stone. But inside the fortress was warm. The cold sheets were a memory, and the king finally was exactly where he belonged. Did this tale of raw, unspoken devotion and a warlord finally claiming his fierce queen keep you on the edge of your seat? If you loved watching Ceres transform from a silent steward into the tactical heart of the pack, and Kalen surrender to the bond he fought for 7 long years, don't let the story end here. Hit that like button, share this video with your fellow fantasy romance addicts, and subscribe to the channel for more epic, grounded, and deeply human monster romance stories. Ring the notification bell so you never miss a midnight premiere.